In a land carved by empires and ambition, one woman rose with the quiet fury of a storm. Amid foreign armies, betrayal, and shifting kingdoms, she stood unbroken, turning resistance into legend. This is the story of Queen Nzinga, the queen who refused to bow. In the early 17th century, the kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba in Central Africa faced a brutal pressure unlike anything they had known before. The expanding Portuguese Empire, driven by the hunger for territory, slaves, and dominance over Angola. From this world of political tension, fractured alliances, and foreign intrusion emerged Nzinga, a princess shaped by conflict, diplomacy, and a profound sense of duty. Her life would become a sweeping saga of strategy, resilience, and defiance as she navigated a landscape where kings fell, armies clashed, and entire nations hung in the balance. But before she became the fearsome queen remembered today, she was a daughter of Ndongo, learning to survive in a world designed to crush her. Dawn broke slowly over the red earth of Ndongo, washing the hills in a soft, amber glow. Mist curled above the grasslands, carrying the distant echo of drums, steady, uncertain, as if the land itself sensed the shifting tides of power. It was on such a morning that a child opened her eyes for the first time. Princess Nzinga came into a world already bracing for storms. In the quiet of her mother's chamber, the midwives whispered her name with a mixture of reverence and fear. For even at birth, it seemed the winds outside had changed direction, as though history had paused to witness her arrival. Ndongo, in the late 16th century, stood on the threshold of transformation and peril. Nestled between dense forests, fertile lands, and the roaring Kwanza River, the kingdom held both beauty and vulnerability. Its ruler, King Kiluwanji Samba, fought tirelessly to preserve the sovereignty his ancestors had built. But the Portuguese, pressing inland from the coast, were tightening their grip with every passing year. Their ambitions reached far beyond trade. They sought bodies, influence, and dominion. It was into this uneasy world that Nzinga was born, the daughter of a king whose power trembled beneath the weight of encroaching foreign ambitions. Even as a child, the palace walls carried the sounds of diplomatic debates, clashing steel, and murmured fears of betrayal. The elders spoke of omens. The warriors sharpened their blades longer than before. And yet, amid this tension, Nzinga's father saw something different in his daughter. An unusual steadiness, a sharp gaze that lingered on maps, court discussions, and decisions far beyond her years. While most royal daughters were groomed for alliances and ceremonial grace, Nzinga found herself drawn to strategy, to counsel, to the quiet language of power. As Nzinga grew, so did the unrest surrounding her. She wandered the courtyards of the Mbadi, the royal compound, listening to the urgent murmurs of messengers arriving from distant provinces. They brought troubling reports: raids on border villages, families taken in the night, and Portuguese envoys demanding loyalty through coercion disguised as diplomacy. She learned quickly that power was not merely inherited, it was contested, shaped, and defended. Her father, sensing her hunger for knowledge, allowed her to sit quietly behind a carved wooden screen during council meetings. From there, she absorbed everything: the measured tones of seasoned diplomats, the fiery pleas of military commanders, and the shifting alliances that determined the kingdom's survival. But the world outside the palace gates delivered its own lessons. Nzinga witnessed the aftermath of the first Portuguese-backed slave raids. She saw women clutching the empty spaces where husbands once stood, children searching the horizon for fathers who would never return, and elders trembling as they recounted the brutality of foreign muskets. These images carved themselves into her memory. They taught her that leadership demanded more than strength. It demanded endurance, empathy, and an unshakable resolve. And though she was still young, something within her stirred each time she saw injustice creep closer to her homeland. The turning point arrived during a season of relentless tension. Rumors had spread of Portuguese forces fortifying new outposts along the Kwanza River. Trade caravans returned lighter, their escorts wearier, and their stories darker. King Kiluwanji gathered his closest advisors for a critical council, and Nzinga, now old enough to sit beside him rather than behind the screen, studied every word exchanged. What she heard that day changed her understanding of the world forever. The council detailed increasing raids conducted by Portuguese-allied Mbangala warriors, mercenaries who cared little for treaties or mercy. Villages were disappearing, bloodlines were being severed, and Ndongo's people were vanishing into the growing machinery of the Atlantic slave trade. Nzinga listened as military commanders argued for retaliation, while elders urged caution, fearing the devastating firepower of Portuguese muskets. Amid this discord, she felt something rising within her, an understanding of her kingdom's fragility, but also of its potential. Later that evening, she walked through the dimly lit corridors of the palace, her father's words echoing behind her. He spoke not of fear, but of responsibility. He reminded her that leadership was forged in moments when the world demanded more than comfort, when it demanded courage. Nzinga realized then that her childhood was ending. The shadows around Ndongo were lengthening, and with them came a silent question she could no longer ignore. The night before the rains, Nzinga stood on a balcony overlooking the kingdom she was born to serve. The torches below flickered, their flames bending gently in the wind, like the spirit of a nation learning to endure. She heard the steady beat of distant drums, the same rhythm that had greeted her at birth. But now the sound felt heavier, burdened by expectations she was only beginning to understand. Far beyond the palace walls, the fires of conflict glowed faintly against the horizon. Her homeland faced a storm that promised to reshape its destiny. And as she gazed into the darkness, one truth settled within her. Perhaps she had been shaped for this moment long before she ever wore a crown. The question remained, was destiny calling her, or had she already begun to claim it? The forests of Central Africa whisper before they roar. Dawn breaks over Ndongo with a thin veil of mist clinging to the valleys, as if the land itself is holding its breath. In those fragile hours, when shadows stretch long and the world feels uncertain, riders gallop through villages carrying news no one wants to hear. From the western coast, a storm is rising. Caravels slice through the Atlantic surf. The Portuguese are pushing inland, muskets glinting, banners snapping, ambition burning hotter than the sun. And somewhere within the heart of this unraveling world stands a young princess, watching, listening, wondering how long it will be before the storm reaches her door. At the dawn of the 17th century, the kingdom of Ndongo sits at a crossroads, powerful, proud, but tied in a tightening web of alliances, rivalries, and uncertain futures. For generations, the Mbundu people have carved their place between rivers and red earth, shaping a kingdom out of resilience and memory. But history rarely honors boundaries. The Portuguese had arrived decades earlier, first with open palms, then with iron fists. What began as trade, copper, ivory, and captives, soon morphed into hunger for territory and rule. Each passing year, their presence grew sharper, heavier. Muskets replaced words, forts rose where forests fell. Missionaries followed soldiers, preaching salvation in one hand and maps in the other. Inside Ndongo's royal court, the mood grows brittle. Not all nobles see the threat the same way. Some believe diplomacy can tame it. Others whisper that war is inevitable, a great fire creeping through dry grass. Princess Nzinga moves through these chambers like a silent witness to history's unfolding script. Intelligent, observant, painfully aware of what others dismiss, she watches the Portuguese envoys enter her father's halls with the arrogance of men who believe destiny favors them. Their eyes roam like surveyors. Their treaties speak with two tongues. Their smiles hide calculations. She sees it all. For the young princess, these moments become an education not taught by any tutor. Lessons in power, in deception, in the machinery of empire. The land outside the capital reflects the tension within. Farmers speak of strange patrols near the borders. Traders note the sudden rise in gunpowder prices. Elders mutter that the river spirits themselves are restless. Ndongo is still standing, strong, proud, but its foundations tremble beneath the surface. It begins subtly, like the first rumble of distant thunder. Portuguese forces push beyond their old boundaries, guided by mercenaries and fueled by a new confidence. They build alliances with breakaway Ndongo nobles, men whose ambitions blind them to consequence. Gold changes hands, promises are made, silence is bought. Divide and rule becomes the rhythm of their advance. Within Ndongo's council chamber, debates turn feverish. Rival factions clash over strategy. Some urge negotiation, believing concessions might buy peace. Others demand mobilization, sensing only treachery in the foreigner's every word. The court fractures, not visibly, not violently, but in quiet cracks that deepen by the day. Nzinga watches her father, Angola struggle beneath the weight of a kingdom pulled in too many directions. His advisors tug at him with competing visions, each certain that their path alone can save Ndongo. But even a king cannot command unity when fear spreads faster than loyalty. Envoys arrive from the west, bearing messages wrapped in diplomacy but dripping with threat. They speak of mutual benefit, of cooperation, of boundaries that might shift for the sake of peace. Every word carefully placed, every clause a trap. Nzinga studies them the way a warrior studies an opponent's stance. She notices how they never bow fully, how they gesture toward the land as if already claiming it, how they speak of Ndongo's people as numbers, labor, bodies, resources, not lives. Beyond the palace walls, the people sense the danger. Children hear their parents whisper late into the night, Hunters vanish near disputed borders. Smoke rises where it shouldn't, and rumors swell like floodwater. The Portuguese are coming deeper. They say they will decide who rules here. They want Ndongo for themselves. Nzinga walks through the villages with her attendants, hearing the tremor beneath every voice. She sees women grinding grain with heavier hands, elders staring at the horizon as if expecting invaders to materialize from the dust. She understands this is no ordinary threat, not a passing conflict, not a war fought only with spears and shields. This is something colder, more calculated, colonial ambition, an empire unfolding its wings. Not through battles alone, but through treaties designed to weaken, alliances formed to divide, pressure applied until kingdoms break from within. Her father feels the tightening noose, and so does she. The turning point arrives not with a roar, but with a message. One morning, under a sky heavy with humidity, a Portuguese delegation arrives unexpectedly. Their horses are sleek, armored. Their muskets gleam like instruments of certainty. At their front rides a man whose smile is thin, controlled. A messenger accustomed to delivering ultimatums disguised as negotiations. Inside the royal hall, the atmosphere thickens. When the envoy speaks, his voice is polite, measured, but edged with something unspoken. He presents a list of demands, veiled beneath requests and agreements, that would strip Ndongo of authority piece by piece. Rights to land, restrictions on trade, oversight on internal disputes, hostages sent to Portuguese forts for education. Every carefully crafted clause reveals a truth Nzinga already suspects. They don't seek partnership. They seek ownership. Her father's face remains steady, but Nzinga sees the tension in his jaw. She feels the weight of the moment pressing on every shoulder in the room. As the envoy continues dictating terms, disinterest flickering in his eyes, Nzinga realizes something profound. This is how empires expand. Not always with bloodshed, sometimes with parchment and poison ink. A silence settles after the reading. A silence thick enough to taste. For the first time, Nzinga senses that Ndongo is standing on the edge of something irreversible. She looks at the men before her. The nobles who hesitate. The soldiers who grip their spears more tightly. The foreign envoy who acts as though he is already victorious. And understands that diplomacy alone will not hold back the tide approaching their borders. Outside in the courtyards, the wind shifts. Dust spirals. Drums beat faintly in distant villages, signals of movements near the frontier. Rumors have hardened into certainty. The Portuguese are positioning for invasion. That afternoon, Nzinga stands atop a hill overlooking the land of her ancestors. The grass below sways in soft waves. Cattle graze peacefully. Children chase one another near the river. Everything looks so calm, so unchanged. But she feels the tremor beneath it. She knows that this peace is an illusion. Soon, muskets will echo through these valleys. Treaties will be broken, borders redrawn, lives uprooted. And as she watches the horizon, one question settles in her chest like a stone. How long until the conflict reaches her own doorstep? As night falls, torches flicker across the capital. Small circles of light surrounded by vast darkness. Nzinga walks alone near the palace gates, listening to the hum of distant drums, the restless shifting of soldiers preparing for whatever comes next. The air feels different, heavier, charged. In that silence, she makes her first unspoken vow. Not of war, not of revenge, but of understanding. She will learn the nature of this enemy, their tactics, their greed, their weaknesses. She will uncover the architecture of their ambition, because kingdoms may fall, but not all succumb without resistance. And as the moon rises over Ndongo, its pale glow touching the earth like a blessing, Nzinga steps back into the palace. No longer just a princess observing history, but a woman preparing to shape it. The sky above Ndongo darkens long before the storm arrives. Smoke moves like wounded shadows across the horizon, drifting over rivers and red plains. The land smells of ash and fear. In the distance, the sound of metal, chains striking one another, muskets loading, echoes like a warning carved into the wind. Through this shifting haze rides a young woman, her gaze steady, her heartbeat silent beneath the chaos. Princess Nzinga. She is no longer the curious child who once studied envoys from behind palace curtains. She rides now through a kingdom bleeding. A princess, born into war. The death of Angola Kilwanje, the king who once held Ndongo together through will and wisdom, changes everything. His passing leaves the kingdom in a precarious balance, vulnerable, fractured, exposed. Power shifts like sand beneath bare feet, and in his place rises Mbandi, Nzinga's brother, burdened by a throne that feels heavier with each passing day. But the crown does not wait for grief to settle. The Portuguese sense weakness, and they move quickly. Their forts, once scattered along the frontier, rise now like iron teeth biting into the land. Muskets crack through forests. Slave-raiding parties plunge deeper into Ndongo's heart, dragging thousands from their homes. Men shackled, women silenced, children stolen into a future they cannot imagine. Each raid is a message, a warning, a test, a claim. In Luanda, colonial officials speak of order and civilization, but their soldiers move with ruthless precision. Their mission is clear: destabilize Ndongo until its people surrender, or run, or disappear. Inside the royal capital of Kabasa, fear levels the ground beneath every political conversation. Advisors argue, generals plead for action. Villagers arrive in endless lines, some wounded, some silent, all broken in places that cannot be healed by herbs or time. Nzinga stands beside her brother during these debates, her expression calm, but her thoughts aflame. She sees what others refuse to confront. This is not merely war. This is transformation, of the land, of the people, of Ndongo itself. The kingdom she once knew is slipping into something darker, something desperate. And every day the question grows louder. Will Ndongo survive? Nzinga refuses to rely on second-hand accounts. She travels, quietly, deliberately, through the villages hit hardest by the Portuguese raids. Dust clings to her sandals as she steps into spaces where life once thrived. She sees granaries burned to their foundations, homes emptied, fields left barren because the hands that tended them are now bound in chains miles away. The silence is the worst part. In one village, she finds a mother sitting before an empty hut, clutching the tiny shoes of her child. Taken before dawn by raiders moving like ghosts through the trees. Her voice is gone. Her tears have dried into the lines of her face. Only her eyes speak, and they speak of loss beyond measure. In another, Nzinga walks through a field where bodies lie abandoned. Warriors who fought until the last arrow broke. She kneels beside one of them, brushing ash from his skin. He cannot answer her questions, but his sacrifice does. Farther south, she meets elders who speak of entire families dragged away. They point to footprints in the dirt, hundreds of them, trailing toward the coast, toward ships waiting across the horizon. A kingdom that once pulsed with community now beats unevenly. A rhythm broken, a people wounded. Every sight carves itself into Nzinga's memory. The smell of burned millet, the dead quiet of an abandoned homestead, the shiver of villagers when Portuguese banners appear in the distance. These moments are more than tragedy. They are fuel. She returns to the capital not as a princess shielded from the world, but as a witness. And her voice in council grows sharper, her advice more urgent. She argues for strategy, for unity, for preparation. She pushes back against hesitation, against those who still believe the Portuguese can be appeased with tribute or softened with diplomacy. Nzinga has seen too much to believe in illusions. Peace, she tells her brother, is not granted by those who profit from our suffering. But even as she advises him, she wrestles with her own doubts. She knows she is still young. She knows the court is crowded with men who underestimate her. And she knows the destiny of kingdoms rarely bends for the will of one woman. Yet, she also knows that silence is a choice, and she refuses to choose it. The turning point arrives during the season when rains hesitate, when the sky holds its breath and the ground cracks beneath the heat. A messenger staggers into Kabasa, half collapsing at the palace gates. His clothes torn, his voice rasped. He brings news from the west. A village near the Lukala River has been attacked. Not raided, destroyed. Mbandi gathers his advisors immediately. The room fills with tension so thick it seems to warp the air. Warrior chiefs demand retaliation. Traders warn that defiance will choke their roots. Older nobles plead for negotiation. Anything to stop the suffering. Arguments clash like shields. Nzinga watches, silent at first, her eyes fixed on the messenger who witnessed it all. When she finally speaks, her voice is steady, but something in it cuts deeper than weapons. "Brother," she says, "this is no longer conflict. This is conquest. Whether we choose diplomacy or war, the Portuguese have already chosen their path." The room falls still. For Mbandi, the weight of rulership grows unbearably clear. His father had faced threats, but not an empire armed with muskets, alliances, and a hunger that spreads like fire across dry land. He turns to his sister, the only person who has walked through both the politics of the palace and the devastation of the villages. "What would you have us do?" he asks. History hangs in the air between them. Nzinga does not offer promises, nor does she speak of victory. She speaks instead with the quiet conviction of someone who has seen suffering and refuses to accept it as fate. "We cannot stop the storm," she replies, "but we can choose how we stand within it." Her words ripple through the chamber, not loud, not theatrical, but grounded, undeniable. And in that moment, something shifts. Mbandi begins to rely on her not merely as a sister, but as a strategist, a mind sharp enough to see through deception, a voice brave enough to challenge fear. It is here, in this chamber filled with uncertainty, that her true role begins. Not just a witness, not just an advisor, but a force capable of shaping the road ahead. Still, as night settles over Kabasa, she stands on the palace terrace staring into the darkness beyond the torches. And the question echoes in her mind: can one woman influence the fate of a nation? She doesn't know the answer. Not yet, but she knows she must try. The moon rises high, pale and cold over the kingdom of Ndongo. Crickets sing in the fields beyond the capital, their voices thin but persistent. Smoke from distant fires drifts across the sky like a silent reminder of the world beyond the palace walls. Nzinga stands at the threshold of her future, a woman born into a time that demands strength, clarity, and defiance. She feels the weight of her people's suffering pressing on her shoulders. And yet, deep within her, something glows like an ember shielded from the wind. Resolve. The path ahead is uncertain, the danger immense, but she has witnessed devastation firsthand, and she has returned not broken, but burning. Empires rise with arrogance, but resistance begins quietly, with a thought, a vow, a single step taken in the direction others fear to walk. As dawn approaches, Nzinga prepares herself, a princess no longer sheltered, a leader shaped by war, and she knows her fight is only beginning. The morning sun rose over the Atlantic like a blade of gold, cutting through the mist that clung to the harbor of Luanda. Ships creaked against the tide, their wooden hulls stained with years of voyages. Voyages that carried soldiers, traders, missionaries, and thousands of stolen lives. It was into this world of trembling chains and polished muskets that Princess Nzinga Mbande stepped ashore. She came not as a captive, not as a supplicant, but as a diplomat, a daughter of Ndongo sent to negotiate with an empire that believed itself unstoppable. And every eye watched her, waiting to see if a single woman could bend the tide of history. Luanda, in the early 1620s, was a city shaped by ambition and brutality. The Portuguese had carved their fortress on the Angolan coast and fortified it with cannons, soldiers, and a growing network of alliances that served their deepening hunger for power. Their mission was clear: dominate trade, expand influence, and secure an unending supply of enslaved Africans to feed Brazil's plantations. To them, Ndongo was not a sovereign nation. It was a resource, an obstacle, a territory to be absorbed. But inside this rising storm, the kingdom of Ndongo still held its ground. King Mbandi, struggling to steady his reign, needed a master negotiator, someone who could match European arrogance with intelligence and resolve. There was only one candidate, Nzinga. She had spent years watching Portuguese envoys speak with carefully sharpened words, offering peace with one hand while arranging raids with the other. She understood their diplomacy. Treaty as weapon, promise as trap, politeness as mask. And now she was being sent directly into their stronghold, a place where alliances were signed by pen, then broken by sword. Yet Nzinga walked toward the governor's palace with calm steps, her mind unclouded. She knew this battle would be fought not with armies, but with presence, dignity, and precision. The meeting hall was built to impress. High ceilings, carved stone pillars, crosses hung between military banners. At the far end sat João Correia de Sousa, the governor of Portuguese Angola, surrounded by officers who studied Nzinga with an almost clinical curiosity. They expected fear, they expected hesitation. They found neither, but they attempted humiliation. A single mat was placed on the floor in the space before the governor. No chair, no bench, only a woven mat where captives usually knelt. It was a message as clear as gunpowder. You are beneath us. Sit where we tell you. For a moment, silence held the room together. Nzinga understood immediately, and she refused. Without breaking eye contact with the governor, she gestured to one of her attendants. The servant knelt behind her, steady and composed. Nzinga lowered herself onto the servant's back with the grace of a queen taking her rightful seat. She had created her own throne. The room shifted. Officers stiffened. Scribes paused mid-stroke, and the governor blinked as if unsure whether to admire or condemn her boldness. In that single act, Nzinga rewrote the balance of the negotiation before a single word was spoken. What followed was one of the most remarkable diplomatic encounters in African history. Nzinga spoke as though the entire kingdom stood behind her. Her voice carried the weight of a sovereign, not a princess. Her arguments were structured, sharp, uncompromising. She acknowledged past conflicts, condemned unjust raids, and exposed each contradiction in Portuguese policy with the precision of a strategist who understood both African politics and European ambitions. The governor and his advisors found themselves cornered, not by force, but by logic, by intelligence, by fearlessness. In a move that stunned the court, Nzinga secured a temporary peace agreement. The return of some Ndongo territory, recognition of Mbande's rule, and a reduction, at least in writing, of Portuguese slave raids. It was a treaty far better than anyone expected her to achieve. And yet, behind every clause, every promise, she sensed danger. The smiles were too polished, the hesitations too carefully hidden, the concessions too generous to be trusted. Nzinga had won the day, but she knew the Portuguese were not a people who bowed to negotiation. They signed treaties to buy time, to rearrange the chessboard, to weaken enemies before striking again. She left the hall victorious, but alert, aware that today's handshake could become tomorrow's betrayal. The sun was sinking as Nzinga rode out of Luanda, casting long shadows across the fields and fortresses she had just outmaneuvered. Behind her, cannon towers stood like silent predators, waiting for the next command. Ahead of her lay Ndongo, weakened, threatened, but not defeated. She carried the treaty in her hands. She carried the truth in her mind. Diplomacy had brought her a victory, but not safety. The Portuguese had not surrendered their ambitions. They had only paused them. Ndongo's survival still hung on a fragile thread, one that could snap at any moment. As the last light dissolved into the horizon, Nzinga asked herself the question that had followed her since childhood. Could diplomacy alone stop an empire built on conquest? Or would she one day be forced to choose another path? The palace of Ndongo stood beneath a sky heavy with summer heat, its copper roofs glinting like a warning. Inside those walls, silence carried more danger than any battlefield. Courtiers whispered along shadowed corridors, their voices thin as smoke, curling into places truth no longer lived. And at the heart of it all was a woman who sensed the storm before anyone else. Nzinga Mbandi, daughter of warriors, walked through a kingdom that felt suddenly unfamiliar. The walls that once echoed with loyalty now trembled with rumor. Allies turned into shadows. Friends became watchers. In Ndongo, betrayal didn't announce itself. It waited, patiently. Ndongo in the early 17th century was a kingdom suspended between two worlds. To the west, Portuguese forces pushed deeper into the interior, offering trade with one hand and taking captives with the other. To the east lay rival kingdoms who watched Ndongo's instability with sharpened ambition. Inside the royal capital of Kabasa, tension thickened with every passing month. King Mbandi, once a fierce and determined ruler, began to unravel under the weight of loss. The death of his mother, the betrayal of provincial leaders, and the constant threat of Portuguese encroachment. Grief clung to him like a second skin, and paranoia followed closely behind. Nobles sensed the shift. Some stepped back, offering cautious loyalty. Others leaned in, exploiting every private doubt, every whispered insecurity. Foreign agents understood the opportunity as well. The Portuguese did not need to topple Ndongo with armies when the court itself could be encouraged to fracture from within. Nzinga saw all of this with painful clarity. She had returned from Luanda not only as a diplomat, but as the most respected strategist in the kingdom. Yet respect could be a dangerous currency. Those who lacked her vision envied it. Those who feared her influence whispered that a woman so admired must be seeking a throne of her own. The palace turned into a chessboard, and every piece moved when she wasn't looking. The first cracks appeared quietly. Reports reached Nzinga that provincial chiefs, long-standing allies of the Mbande family, were meeting in secret, discussing new loyalties and old grievances. Some claimed Mbandi was cursed. Others argued that the dynasty had lost the ancestral blessings once carried by their father. But the most poisonous rumor spread like a stain, that Nzinga herself had bewitched her brother. It was the kind of lie that grew legs quickly in a kingdom where superstition and politics often intertwined. Portuguese traders encouraged the whispers, careful to keep their names distant. A weakened Ndongo meant easier conquest, and a rift between Nzinga and her brother meant no one stood between them and the interior slave routes they coveted. Inside the palace, Nzinga fought back with the only weapons she trusted: clarity, strategy, and an unwavering sense of duty. She counseled Mbandi to strengthen alliances, to restore trust through decisive generosity, to show unity in public even when fear hollowed him in private. But grief had hardened him, and fear made him listen to the wrong voices. Advisors driven by self-interest began to dominate the royal chambers. They warned him that his sister had become too powerful, too beloved, too essential. They twisted her successes into threats. They painted her competence as ambition. Slowly, painfully, Mbandi pulled away. The siblings who once survived exile together now stood on opposite ends of a widening chasm. One seeking to protect the kingdom, the other trying desperately to protect himself. Tension reached its breaking point on a night heavy with rain. Thunder rolled over Kabasa as Nzinga entered the royal hall, summoned by her brother for what she hoped would be reconciliation. But one look at Mbandi's eyes told her everything. They were clouded, not with anger, but with dread. He believed the whispers. The lies had found a home inside him. He accused her softly at first, as though afraid of his own words. Accused her of undermining him, of gathering loyalists, of plotting a future that did not include him. Nzinga did not raise her voice. She did not defend herself with the fire her enemies expected. Instead, she stepped closer, speaking in the quiet tones of someone who still remembered the frightened boy he had once been. The brother she had protected when their father fell, when their family was torn by rebellion, when exile was their only refuge. But the room was full of watching eyes, and pride is a hard thing to loosen in the presence of an audience. Mbandi dismissed her. The doors closed behind her with a finality that felt almost prophetic. Within months, tragedy struck. Mbandi, once the rightful heir, once the warrior prince, died suddenly. Some said poison. Others whispered suicide. History offers no certain answer. But in the court of Ndongo, grief quickly turned into opportunism. And the silence that followed his death carried a new and heavy question. Who would rule now? For Nzinga, the answer felt like a wound, one that cut deeper than any blade. The palace stood still in the humid dawn. Smoke drifted from ceremonial fires. Court musicians played the slow, mournful rhythms reserved for a fallen king. And Nzinga walked through the courtyard with the measured steps of someone who carried both memory and responsibility. The path to the throne had opened, not with triumph, but with loss. Every whisper of betrayal, every fracture within the court had led to this moment. She paused beneath the ancient baobab tree where her father once taught her the meaning of duty. Its roots twisted deep into the earth, unshaken by storms. Nzinga wondered if she could do the same. To lead, she realized, was not to claim power, but to survive what power demanded. And her true test was only beginning. Dawn breaks slowly over the highlands of Ndongo, not with brilliance, but with a muted, heavy light, as if the sun itself hesitates to rise over a wounded kingdom. Mist curls above the valley like the breath of forgotten spirits. The drums are silent, the birds do not sing, and in that silence, a woman stands alone. Her silhouette is carved against the pale horizon, tall, unmoving, as though she were a statue grieving for the world beneath her. She has lost a father. She has lost a brother. She has lost the innocence of her youth. Yet today, history bends toward her. Today, Nzinga will rise as queen. The kingdom she inherits is a kingdom carved by war. For decades, Portuguese muskets have rattled through villages, tearing families from the soil that raised them. Slave raiders prowl the forests. Missionaries write letters that describe Africa as a land to be civilized. Mercenaries, drunk on promises of gold and power, march deeper into Ndongo's heartlands. And within the royal court, the wounds cut deeper still. Noble houses whisper in corners, each one calculating what Nzinga's rise might mean for their influence. Some fear her, some doubt her, some see opportunity in her inexperience. The Mbande dynasty, once a pillar of unity, now stands fractured, drained by betrayal, poisoned by foreign interference. When Mbandi, her brother, fell into despair and death, hope seemed ready to crumble with him. But in the darkest moments, Ndongo remembers something older than fear. Older than the Portuguese, older than kings. It remembers a prophecy whispered by elders. In the time of great storms, a lioness shall reign. And across the plains, across burned fields and trembling villages, the name begins to spread again. Nzinga, the woman who knelt on no man's floor. The diplomat who stared empire in the eye and did not blink. Now she must become more, not a negotiator, not a princess, but a ruler forged by fire. The coronation ground lies deep within the sacred grove. A clearing ringed by ancient trees whose roots twist like the veins of time itself. Torches flicker at their bases, casting restless shadows across the earth. Every flame seems to move with anticipation, as though the forest already knows the world is shifting. Nzinga walks slowly toward the center, her footsteps quiet, deliberate. She wears no heavy jewels, no gilded cloak, no ornament meant to impress foreign eyes. Instead, she wears the colors of the land, red for struggle, black for endurance, white for the spirits who watch. The nobles line the circle, their faces unreadable. Some bow, some merely incline their heads, some do not move at all. But all of them watch. The air feels thick, as if holding its breath. The chief priest steps forward, holding a spear carved with symbols older than the kingdom itself. In the old tradition, the spear represents the weight of rule, the burden of protection and justice. It is not handed lightly. It is not handed to the weak. Nzinga lowers her head, but only for a moment. Then she lifts her gaze again, sharp and unwavering. This is the moment they judge her. This is the moment she must decide who she will be. Queen by blood or queen by defiance? The priest raises the spear, but before he can place it in her hands, A murmur ripples through the gathered nobles. One steps forward, a high-ranking lord whose loyalty has always shifted like sand. He speaks softly, but his words carry poison. Ndongo has never known a woman ruler. How can we trust that she will bring anything but ruin? The crowd stiffens. Torches crackle. Even the wind seems to pause. Nzinga does not flinch. Slowly, she steps toward the man. Her shadow stretches across the ground until it merges with his. She stops only inches from him, her voice calm, too calm. "You fear ruin," she says, "but ruin has already entered our homes. It marches under a foreign flag, and you question me." While bending your knee to them, the noble's face pales. The circle erupts into whispers. Nzinga reaches out and takes the spear herself, not waiting for approval, not waiting for ceremony. The old priest hesitates, then bows his head, not to tradition, but to the inevitability of her will. With the spear in her grasp, she lifts it high, the metal catching the morning sun and scattering it in sharp, defiant fragments. In that instant, the court sees it, not a woman replacing a king, but a storm replacing silence, a force that does not ask permission and never will. As the drums finally begin their slow, thunderous rhythm, Nzinga steps onto the raised stone at the center of the grove. Her people gather around her, weary, wounded, yet watching with something dangerously close to hope. She feels the weight of the spear. She feels the weight of destiny. Kings before her have fought and fallen. Diplomacy has bought time but not safety. War has taken much but restored nothing. Now, a different path must be carved. One forged by cunning, courage, and a fire that will not dim. As she looks out across the grove, across her people, across the land she must now defend, one truth settles in her heart like a stone. To lead, she will lose more. But to not lead, she will lose everything. The lioness has taken the throne, and the world is about to tremble. Night drapes itself over the forests of Central Africa, thick and heavy like a mourning cloth. The fires of Ndongo glow faintly in the distance, not as symbols of life, but as the last embers of a kingdom under siege. The wind carries the crackle of burning fields, and the quiet sobs of families fleeing into the darkness. And through the shadows rides a figure cloaked in determination, her posture unbroken, her eyes reflecting both loss and resolve. Nzinga, princess no longer. Queen not yet, but something far greater. A leader carrying the soul of a nation on her shoulders. Tonight she rides toward exile and toward destiny. The fall of Ndongo is not sudden. It unfolds slowly, like a great tree rotting from its roots, while still appearing strong from a distance. Portuguese forces tighten their grip, fortifying settlements with cannons and stone. Slave traders sweep across villages like locusts, leaving behind the ashes of homes and the silence of absence. Children vanish, elders are dragged away, entire bloodlines disappear overnight. And in the royal courts of Ndongo, betrayal weaves itself like a spider's web, each thread pulling the kingdom closer to collapse. When the final blow arrives, Nzinga is forced to do what few leaders could swallow: abandon the lands of her ancestors. But retreat is not defeat, not for her. Beyond Ndongo's borders lies Matamba, a neighboring kingdom with a history of fierce independence and complex loyalties. To some, it is a refuge. To others, a political labyrinth. To Nzinga, it is both sanctuary and battlefield. As she enters Matamba, the earth beneath her feet feels different. Not home, not yet. The forests are denser, the air heavier, the spirits restless. But within this land lies possibility, hidden beneath layers of tradition and power. Nzinga knows one truth: if she cannot reclaim Ndongo from within, she will rebuild from without. And she will not rebuild small. She will rebuild an empire. Matamba greets her with wary eyes. Its nobles, accustomed to their own ways and their own ambitions, study Nzinga in silence. A displaced ruler, a queen without a throne, a woman carrying both the grief of loss and the fire of defiance. But Nzinga does not lower her gaze. In the palace of Matamba, a complex of earth-red walls and carved wooden pillars, she begins the slow, deliberate work of reshaping power. First, she speaks to the spiritual leaders, winning their blessing through a mixture of diplomacy and undeniable presence. Then, she negotiates with war chiefs, offering something few rulers can give: purpose. But her greatest revolution is not in palaces. It is in the forests. Across Central Africa, escaped slaves wander in desperate search of refuge. Warriors broken by defeat drift like ghosts. Families uprooted by Portuguese raids seek shelter. Nzinga welcomes them all. She calls them the children of the kingdom yet to be born. She trains them, arms them, builds them into a new force, loyal not to a lineage or a territory, but to her vision of freedom. Matamba, once a modest kingdom, begins to change. Its borders bristle with warriors. Its villages echo with the beat of renewed pride. And its forests shelter thousands determined never again to bow to foreign chains. A new capital rises, not of stone but of belief. And at its center stands Nzinga. The Portuguese expect Nzinga to disappear into exile, a fading memory, a defeated queen clinging to old glory. Instead, she becomes more dangerous than ever. From Matamba, she strikes with precision. Her soldiers, familiar with the terrain, move like shadows across rivers and forests. They raid Portuguese outposts, free captives, ambush caravans, disrupt trade routes. Every attack sends echoes through the colonial machine, whispers of a queen who cannot be contained. But Nzinga is not fighting alone. European rivals, the Dutch, see opportunity in her defiance. They offer muskets, ammunition, tactical knowledge. Nzinga accepts, not as a subordinate, but as an equal playing a long game. Her alliances expand, rebel chiefs join her, escaped slaves swear loyalty. Even Matamba's skeptics bend beneath her growing influence. And then comes her greatest triumph. In a bold military campaign, Nzinga captures the throne of Matamba itself, not as an exile, but as its rightful queen. Through a combination of diplomacy, strategic marriages, and sheer presence, she becomes ruler of two worlds. Queen of Ndongo in spirit, Queen of Matamba in fact. The drums of Matamba thunder across the valleys. Torches blaze through the night. Her army stands larger than ever, hardened, loyal, and unstoppable. Her legend sharpens like a blade, but deep inside another truth whispers. No matter how high she rises, the empire against her rises higher still. Night settles again over Matamba, but this time the air feels different. Not defeated, not desperate, alive. Nzinga stands atop a cliff overlooking her new kingdom. Forests stretching endlessly, dotted with the faint glow of village fires. Behind her lies a land rebuilt from ashes. Before her lies a path lined with danger and possibility. She has created a refuge for the broken, a fortress for the hunted, a beacon for all who refuse to kneel. Yet she knows the truth that shadows her every victory. Portugal does not tire. Portugal does not forgive. Portugal does not stop. The empire she defies has ships, armies, and wealth without end. But she has something they have never understood. A people who believe in her. A kingdom reborn under her crown. A will sharpened by loss. As the night wind rises, carrying the scent of firewood and hope, Nzinga asks the question that haunts every leader touched by greatness. How long can one woman outrun an empire? And in the silence, the world seems to hold its breath. Night hangs heavy over the Central African highlands. The moon, pale and watchful, glides above a canopy of whispering leaves. A distant drumbeat trembles through the dark. Not a celebration, but a warning. In the shadows between trees, figures glide like wind across water. Silent, focused, unseen. Here, far from the stone fortresses of Europe, a different kind of war is being shaped. A war of darkness, deception, and patience. And at its center stands a queen, unbroken, unbent, unafraid. This is the beginning of Nzinga's art of defiance. The mid-17th century has carved deep scars across the kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba. The Portuguese push further inland each year, chasing profits pulled from flesh. The brutal machinery of the slave trade grinding relentlessly forward. Their forts grow like iron thorns across the land, each one a reminder of how quickly an empire can swallow a people. And yet, the forest remembers its own children. For Queen Nzinga, this era is more than a battlefield. It is a test of endurance. A war for survival wrapped in centuries of political betrayal and colonial ambition. Her armies have been battered, her alliances strained, and her homeland threatened from every direction. The cost is measured not in silver, but in lives stolen and futures erased. But where others see despair, Nzinga sees strategy. She knows the land. Its rivers like veins, its forests like sheltering walls, its mountains like silent sentinels. She knows her enemy. Disciplined yet arrogant, armored yet slow, trained but unfamiliar with these shifting landscapes. And she knows her people. Resilient, fiercely loyal, shaped by hardship and hope. So she abandons the old rules of warfare. No more waiting for battles on open fields. No more fighting on terms dictated by cannons and cavalry. Instead, she turns to the earth itself, the quiet power beneath the leaves, and begins shaping a different kind of resistance. A war that does not announce itself. A war that teaches an empire how fear truly feels. It begins with silence, then movement, then disappearance. Small units slip through the forests, barefoot to muffle sound. Warriors paint their bodies with ash and earth, blending with the terrain until they are indistinguishable from the night. Scouts memorize every bend of every river, every clearing, every echo of every cave. Nothing is random, nothing is wasted. Nzinga studies Portuguese supply routes the way a hunter studies a herd. Not with anger, but precision. She strikes where they are weakest, lonely forts, caravans heavy with captives, patrols too confident to imagine danger in the brush. The first ambush comes at dawn. A convoy moves slowly along the riverbank. Guards half asleep, slaves chained and exhausted. Then, from the thicket, a burst of arrows tears through the stillness. Warriors erupt from the foliage, swift and silent, blades flashing like lightning. Before the Portuguese can even raise their muskets, the jungle has swallowed its own rebels again. To the enslaved, the attack is salvation. To the Portuguese, it is confusion. To Nzinga, it is a message. Freedom does not need an army. It needs a spark. Forts that once felt secure now tremble with paranoia. Soldiers wake at every rustle of branches. Supply lines shrink, slave routes fracture. Nzinga doesn't defeat them by strength. She defeats them by uncertainty. Word spreads across the region. The queen fights in shadows now. And in those shadows, her legend grows sharper with every victory. But even brilliance has a cost. For every victory, there is an unmarked grave. For every ambush, a family torn apart by retaliation. Guerrilla war is nimble, but it is also draining. A constant dance with hunger, exhaustion, and grief. Villages relocate endlessly to evade Portuguese raids. Fields are burned to deny resources to the enemy, leaving communities struggling to feed themselves. And Nzinga, the woman who can bend strategy like a bowstring, feels the heaviness settling around her. At night, she studies maps drawn on animal hide, illuminated by the soft flicker of a fire. Lines marking Portuguese forts, dotted paths tracing slave routes, notes scribbled by scouts, patrol movement increasing, new cannons shipped upriver, more mercenaries arriving. The empire she fights is vast, wealthy, persistent, its resources seemingly endless. And somewhere within her mind, a quiet question takes root. How long can we outlast an enemy that never tires? Yet when dawn breaks, she stands before her commanders with the same unshakable resolve. Her voice steady, her strategy clear, her belief unbroken. For Nzinga knows something the Portuguese do not. A people fighting for survival can endure longer than an empire fighting for profit. Her forces strike again, not out of desperation, but determination. They sabotage a major fort, crippling Portuguese control of the interior. They ambush a slave caravan, freeing hundreds destined for ships waiting on the coast. They poison wells used by enemy patrols. They vanish into forests that seem to welcome them like kin. Portuguese commanders begin to speak her name with a mixture of frustration and respect. Reports sent back to Luanda paint her not as a rebel, but as a commander whose brilliance rivals European generals. Still, the question lingers. Victory feels closer than ever. But so does exhaustion. An empire can replace its soldiers. Nzinga cannot replace her people, and she must decide. Is freedom won by relentless defiance, or by surviving long enough to build something new? In the twilight, the forest glows with the last embers of fading sunlight. The queen stands at the edge of her camp, watching the sky darken into deep indigo. The air is still, carrying the distant echo of a river moving quietly through the land she refuses to surrender. Behind her, warriors sharpen spears. Scouts whisper news from the frontier. Children sleep beneath shelters built from branches and hope. This is the world forged by defiance, fragile, fierce, unyielding. Nzinga closes her eyes for a moment, hearing both the heartbeat of her people and the thunder of an empire marching ever closer. Freedom is within reach, but at what cost? As night settles over Matamba, the queen knows her war is far from over. But she also knows this truth. Empires may have armies, yet the land, the forest, and the hearts of the oppressed have chosen her. Dawn breaks slowly over the kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba, not with brilliance, but with a muted, silvery light. As if the sun itself hesitates to rise over a land shaped by too many years of war. Smoke from distant hearths curls into the morning sky, carrying with it the scent of earth, of rebuilding, of quiet resilience. Along the riverbanks, women plant seeds in soil once churned by marching armies. Children chase each other between half-rebuilt homes. And on a ridge above them all, a queen stands alone, watching the river's slow, patient current. For Queen Nzinga, this is more than a sunrise. It is the beginning of a new tide, one that might finally turn in her favor. The landscape of Central Africa has changed, not in a single moment, but in the steady erosion of power that even empires cannot escape. For decades, the Portuguese tightened their hold on Ndongo and Matamba, building forts, enslaving thousands, and forcing kingdoms into the grinding machinery of their Atlantic ambitions. But time has a way of reshaping strength. Europe's geopolitical storms begin to ripple outward. Portugal faces threats from the Dutch, rivalries with Spain, and unrest in its own colonies. Resources thin, soldiers are recalled. Ambition outweighs capacity, and suddenly, the empire that once moved with unstoppable force now hesitates. It stumbles. It recalculates. Nzinga senses it before most. She has spent her life reading the movements of enemies, allies, and the land itself. She knows when a predator weakens. She knows when an opportunity is more than chance, when it is an opening carved by fate. Her own kingdom, battered yet unbroken, stands ready for a different kind of fight. Not ambushes in the dark or battles beneath scorching suns, but diplomacy, strategy, patience. Where swords once clashed, words must now be sharpened. Yet the air carries the weight of old scars. Treaties have been broken before, promises twisted, agreements erased the moment they proved inconvenient to colonial profit. Even so, Nzinga steps onto this new battlefield without fear, for she understands a truth the Portuguese have forgotten. A queen who survives war becomes dangerous in peace. Diplomacy begins quietly, with whispers, emissaries, and cautious letters carried between forests and forts. Portuguese officials, overstretched and under-resourced, attempt to open channels long sealed by conflict. They seek negotiation not out of goodwill but necessity. And Nzinga, ever the strategist, seizes the reins of the moment. Meetings take place in neutral territories, wooden palisades, open courtyards, or riverside huts where the sound of flowing water masks tense breaths. Portuguese envoys arrive in stiff uniforms, muskets at their backs, eyes watchful. Nzinga arrives adorned in ceremonial regalia, but her posture speaks not of submission, only command. There is silence before every conversation. A silence shaped by memory, of villages burned, people chained, families torn apart. Nzinga feels every echo of that history. She carries it into the room like a shield. Her voice when she speaks is calm, deliberate, controlled. She doesn't plead, she doesn't threaten. She negotiates from the foundation she has built, a fortified Matamba, a network of allies, and a legend of resistance that Europeans cannot dismiss. She demands recognition of her sovereignty, freedom for her people, an end to the slave raids that have drained the region for decades. Land once stolen must be returned. Treaties must be honored with tangible proof, not empty words. The Portuguese listen, not because they want peace, but because they need it. Their empire is stretched thin, their coffers lighter, their soldiers fewer. And for the first time in years, Nzinga speaks into a room where the balance of power leans in her favor. But diplomacy is a battlefield with no clear victories. Behind every handshake lies suspicion. Behind every promise lies the memory of betrayal. Nzinga knows this better than anyone. She has watched treaties turn to dust the moment they were signed. She has seen allies become informants, enemies become partners, and partners become threats. So even as peace nears, her heart remains guarded. One negotiation takes place on a humid afternoon beneath a thatched pavilion. Portuguese envoys present documents promising new boundaries and reduced raids. They claim the crown seeks stability, prosperity, cooperation. Nzinga studies their expressions, the twitch of a lip, the flicker of an eye, the hesitance hidden beneath polite gestures. She sees fear, calculation, uncertainty. She sees an empire unsure of its future, and she senses opportunity. Her advisors wait behind her, holding their breath as she leans forward. She does not sign immediately. Instead, she asks a question so simple it cuts deeper than any threat. How many times must my people bleed before your peace becomes real? The envoys have no answer, because the truth is this: treaties do not erase graves. Cooperation does not erase chains. Peace built on convenience is as fragile as dried leaves in a storm. Yet Nzinga signs, not out of trust, but strategy. She knows this moment is a cornerstone, a chance to rebuild villages, replant fields, and restore families fractured by war. A chance to turn Matamba from fortress to kingdom once more. A chance to secure a future where children grow up knowing harvests instead of hiding places. But even as the ink dries, the question lingers in her mind. Can enemies ever truly become partners? Or are treaties merely pauses between storms? Evening descends, casting long shadows across Matamba. Nzinga walks alone through a courtyard where new bricks dry in the fading light. The sounds of construction echo around her, hammers tapping, voices singing softly, the murmured rhythm of a nation rebuilding itself. She pauses beside a mound of fresh soil where saplings sway gently in the breeze. These trees, planted by villagers, are meant to grow tall in memory of those lost to war. Their roots reach deep into land once soaked with suffering, a promise that life will return. Nzinga touches one slender trunk, feeling the pulse of possibility beneath its bark. She has secured peace, for now. Yet she knows the tides of fate never stay still. Empires rise and falter, alliances shift like sand. Trust is slow to grow and quick to crumble. But as the wind stirs the leaves overhead, she breathes deeply and allows herself one rare moment of hope. The morning mist clung to the hills of Matamba like a soft veil, drifting slowly over the land that had tasted war for nearly half a century. In the quiet, where once drums of resistance had thundered, only the rustle of leaves remained, a fragile peace breathing its first calm sigh. And there, seated beneath an ancient marula tree, Queen Nzinga watched the sun rise over her kingdom. Her hands, once calloused from spear and shield, now rested gently atop her walking staff. The warrior who had outwitted generals, broken sieges, and bent history into the shape she desired, was entering her final chapter. And for the first time in decades, the battlefield was silent. The year was drawing toward its final seasons, and with it came a transformation no one had dared predict. For decades, the Portuguese had pressed against Matamba, carving their way across Central Africa with gunpowder and ambition. Nzinga had pushed back, with diplomacy, with force, with alliances stitched together under moonlit forests. Her people had endured famine, displacement, and relentless conflict. The soil itself seemed soaked with the cost of survival. Yet time has a way of softening the edges of even the fiercest storms. By her later years, the world had shifted. The Portuguese, exhausted by their own wars and intrigues, began to recognize something undeniable. Nzinga was not a queen to be subdued. She was a sovereign to be bargained with. And so, after years of negotiations, cautious, delicate, stubborn, a peace was forged. It was not the peace of surrender, nor the peace of silence. It was a peace built on recognition, on boundaries respected, on the political gravity Nzinga had carved from decades of resilience. This new calm settled slowly across Matamba. Burned villages sprouted new thatched roofs. Children who had grown up listening to stories of war suddenly tasted a childhood without fear. Elders who had hidden in forests now returned to ancestral lands with trembling, hopeful hands. Peace, real peace, had finally come. With the guns quiet, Nzinga's gaze shifted from battlefields to rebuilding. It was a different kind of war, a fight against the scars left behind. She traveled from village to village, carried not by pomp, but by purpose. Her presence alone brought crowds, mothers who had lost sons, warriors missing limbs, families fractured by decades of unrest. They gathered to see the woman who had refused to let their story end in defeat. She listened more now than she spoke. To the farmers who needed tools, to the healers who needed herbs, to the young men who wanted guidance, not glory. The queen who once commanded armies now nurtured futures. Population loss weighed heavily on her. Matamba's fields needed hands, its markets needed voices. And so she welcomed refugees, negotiated for the return of captives, and encouraged inter-village cooperation. Every restored household, every rebuilt shrine, every field replanted was a small victory, a quiet triumph louder than any war cry. As stability grew, so did her role as mentor. In the royal court, she gathered a new generation of advisors and commanders. She watched them debate, strategize, stumble, learn. She corrected them with a sharp eye but a gentler heart. These were the leaders who would inherit the peace she had fought so long to secure. For the first time in her life, Nzinga was building not for survival, but for legacy. The moment that defined her final years did not come with ceremony, nor with the thunder of victory. It came in a quiet council hall, lit by the soft glow of oil lamps, as Nzinga met with the young nobles who would shape Matamba after her. They stood around her, some barely older than she had been when she first faced colonial armies. Their questions were earnest, their ambitions sharp, their ideas bold and brimming with confidence. They had not lived the years of smoke and blood that had shaped her generation. They had inherited peace without carrying its weight. One evening, after a lengthy council, a young commander approached her. "Mother of Matamba," he said with reverence, "the Portuguese fear us now. Perhaps this is the time to strike, to expand." Nzinga looked into his eager eyes. Once, she might have echoed that fire, but now, she saw the shadows behind such boldness, the cost, the orphaned villages, the fractured families. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do not mistake peace for weakness," she whispered, "and do not mistake conquest for strength. I fought so you would not have to." In that moment, she understood the truth of her journey. She had been forged by conflict, shaped by resistance, but the next era belonged to those who would build, not battle. The turning point was not on a battlefield. It was in the quiet acceptance that her greatest achievement was not victory, but restraint. In her final years, Nzinga often returned to the marula tree overlooking the valley, the same place where she had watched the sunrise after peace was secured. Children now played in the fields below, their laughter rising like birdsong. Traders crossed the roads without escort. Smoke from homes drifted into the sky, not from burning raids but from evening meals. She rested there, watching a generation that would never know what it cost to give them this calm. And in the fading light, a question lingered in her mind. Not of power or legacy, but of memory. Would they remember? Would they understand the sacrifices that shaped their world? As the sun dipped below the horizon, The Queen of Matamba, warrior and stateswoman, closed her eyes. Peace, long, hard, and dearly won, finally cradled her kingdom, and history exhaled. In the stillness of dawn, long after the drums of Matamba had gone quiet, a wind moved through the tall grass, soft, almost reverent. It carried whispers, fragments of a story woven into the very soil of Angola. A story of a woman who refused to kneel, even as empires rose like storms against her. Queen Nzinga had taken her final breath, but the land did not mourn in silence. Instead, it pulsed with memory. Memories of battles survived, alliances forged, and a defiance so fierce that even death felt like a mere transition, not an end. Her body rested, her legacy woke. Nzinga's death in 1663 marked more than the passing of a monarch. It marked the fall of a fortress built from will alone. For over 4 decades, she had stood against the Portuguese expansion that threatened to swallow Central Africa. Through war, negotiation, deception, diplomacy, and unwavering resilience, she carved space where none was offered. But now, the queen who had once ridden at the front of her armies was gone. And with her absence came a strange quiet, a moment suspended between grief and reverence. Across Ndongo and Matamba, elders recited her deeds around evening fires. Traders spoke her name as they crossed dusty roads. Mothers told their daughters of the woman who confronted armies with nothing but strategy and raw determination. Her story seeped into oral tradition, passed from voice to voice, generation to generation. Yet Nzinga's legacy did not stay within her borders. Portuguese chroniclers, often reluctant to praise their adversaries, found themselves documenting her brilliance. European letters spoke of her astonishing intelligence, her unpredictable strategies, her unyielding spirit. And beyond Africa, in distant centuries yet to come, her name would ignite imaginations. Scholars, artists, dancers, revolutionaries, each grasping a part of her, each trying to understand how one woman had carved her legend into the architecture of empire. Nzinga was gone, but her shadow, long, powerful, unbroken, remained. In the years immediately following her death, Matamba did not collapse as many enemies predicted. Instead, it leaned on the foundations she had built. The treaties she secured held firm. The leaders she mentored carried her teachings like torches into uncertain nights. The women she had empowered continued to serve as warriors, diplomats, and advisors. Yet something deeper unfolded, a quiet transformation, not in politics, but in memory. Stories of Nzinga grew, carried by griots who had watched her rise from princess to general, from exile to queen. They spoke of the time she used her own servant as a human throne to assert dominance over the Portuguese governor. The time she disguised herself as a man to meet foreign negotiators on equal terms. The battles waged in swamp and forest, where Portuguese muskets struggled to match the cunning of Nzinga's guerrilla fighters. These stories drifted far beyond Matamba. Traders carried them along the Kwanza River. Captives, forced onto ships bound for the Americas, whispered her name as a final act of resistance. Even as they crossed the Atlantic in chains, Nzinga remained a spark, a reminder that resistance was possible, that dignity could survive captivity, that identity could endure oppression. As centuries unfolded, memory wrapped itself around her, layering truth with symbolism, history with myth. She became not only a queen but a symbol of possibility, a figure whose life held meaning wherever freedom was threatened. But it was in the modern era, long after colonial borders had been drawn and redrawn, that Nzinga's legacy surged into something larger, something global. African nationalists of the 19th and 20th centuries looked back and found in her a blueprint of defiance. Leaders fighting colonial rule invoked her name in speeches, chanting it to inspire crowds. Artists carved sculptures in her image. Musicians wrote songs in her honor. Playwrights resurrected her voice on stage. She became a symbol etched into the cultural memory of Angola, a mother of resistance, a patron of independence. By the mid-20th century, as Angola fought its long war for liberation, Nzinga's face appeared on banners carried by rebels in the dense forests she once defended. Her strategies, alliances, mobility, psychological warfare, were studied anew. The revolutionaries saw themselves not simply as fighters, but as inheritors of a legacy centuries in the making. She had resisted the first wave of colonial expansion. They resisted the last. And then came the turning point that cemented her immortality. Modern African historians, freed from the distortions of colonial scholarship, revisited her life with fresh eyes. They uncovered depth, nuance, and brilliance long buried beneath European bias. Nzinga was no longer merely a warrior queen. She was a stateswoman, a strategist, a diplomat ahead of her time. The world began to ask a question once whispered only in Angola. How did one woman hold back an empire? And the more scholars searched, the more her legend expanded. Nzinga had not simply resisted history, she had rewritten it. Today, monuments rise where her armies once marched. Schools bear her name. Statues in Luanda capture her gaze. Sharp, unyielding, forever watching over the nation she fought to preserve. Artists paint her with fire in her eyes. Dancers reenact her confrontations with colonial governors. Filmmakers frame her story in sweeping scenes of courage and survival. But her true monument lives in memory, in the pulse of Angola's independence, in the determination of Africans across the continent, in every voice that refuses to bend under oppression. Nzinga stands at the crossroads of myth and history, her footprints blurred, her spirit unmistakable. She lived as a queen, she died as a legend. And in the echoes of time, one truth remains: empires fall, but the courage of an unbroken woman never fades.